really Tolkien was writing for a misrepresented, underrepresented, and misunderstood and misappropriated culture. Okay? Now, what is Rings of Power really promoting? Is it really promoting something that's timeless and can be considered a classic? Or is it trying to promote what we're all just really dealing with right now and the various short-term, short-sighted, not short-term, but short-sighted visions we all have for our communities and our society, So what is it? Yes, we're talking about Lord of the Rings and the fandom that is around it, and the toxic fans and the passionate fans and the light fans and the old fans. So please tell me what you think in the comments below. If you're going to be watching Rings of Power or not, like, share, and subscribe. I upload every Wednesday. Into the show. Hello and welcome back to another episode of Never Drop Your Sword. I am your host, Callie Sue, and I am out in the woods today because this just seems like the best and proper place to discuss some Tolkien. Forgive me, you are going to hear dogs, horses, probably some vehicles from the road behind me. I didn't have time, as you can see, it's sunset, and I didn't have time to hike far enough in to really be able to get some nice quiet sound for you guys, and I don't have a studio just yet. So welcome to the woods and welcome to my life where there's a lot going on. Today I wanted to talk about Tolkien and the Rings of Power from Amazon. Now I'm going to get my drink ready here. Got some ale that I'm going to pop open. Well, it's actually not ale, it's cider, because I'm celiac. Don't feel sorry for me, please don't. I've got plenty to drink and eat, lots of meat, lots of veggies, and cider, which I happen to like very much. I thought it might be kind of fun to reminisce under a nice faithful friend and have a nice mug with you guys here, because I've actually been to Oxford, thank goodness, many moons ago, and went and sat under the very tree that Professor J.R.R. Tolkien used to sit under in Oxford, and his friend C.S. Lewis, and also at the pub where the two of them, along with many other writers, used to discuss their stories. So, yes, I am a fan. I am a huge fan of Tolkien, and this is not a show review. You've got excellent channels like George the Giant Slayer, Critical Drinker, and Frey. These other channels have the reviews that you want. They have the dirt and the scoop that you want on details and all that kind of stuff. I'm actually here because I want to bring the fandom together, and I want to say welcome to new Tolkien fans, to new Lord of the Rings fans at least, and the show Rings of Power, and talk about the 3 different fan groups and why there seems to be so much toxicity and war around those 3 fan groups. Hey Clancy, you want to say hi? This is Clancy. She is a Springer Spaniel, and she's my good buddy. I happen to be a Anglophile, I guess is the proper term for it. Everything British. I am mostly Scottish and Irish and Welsh I really enjoy, and plenty of English things too. All right, 3 different fans of the Tolkien world. So we've got fans of Tolkien himself and people who grew up reading the books and really love getting to know the author and the person that he was and what his intentions were with art, where he came from, people that really want to deep dive. And those are the oldest fans, I would say, that grew up reading the books first. Then we have a second group of fandom that became fans of Lord of the Rings and the world of Middle-earth and the aesthetic that was created by Alan Howe and Peter Jackson and Philippia Boyens and Fran Walsh from the Lord of the Rings trilogy movies from the early O's. Then we also have people who are just fans of the aesthetic of fantasy and Middle-earth and elves and hobbits, people who like cozy things and they identify and enjoy some portion of the fantasy world and all of its influences. So they're also going to be on the more, they're not going to care so much about following lore exactly or following the books exactly. They just love that kind of material. Now, those third kind of fans, which are kind of light fans, if you will, they have other things that they're passionate about. And I'm sure that when those stories, when those things that they love are attacked, they'll be just as passionate as Tolkien fans are right now over the controversy of the Rings of Power. So that's the 3 types of people generally that we're talking about. And I want to talk a little bit about Tolkien's intentions. I didn't know the man, so obviously I don't know all of that, but I'm putting my voice to this because I think that it's, like I said, to bring some balance, to welcome new fans, and to explain why people are throwing the words toxic and controversial, why there are people that are completely, protesting or refusing to watch the Rings of Power or are so vehement about it. And I have to say that I am on that side. I'm actually an old fan, if you will. And I drew a line when I saw that Amazon Studios was going to be making the Rings of Power or contributing to the Lord of the Rings world. When I saw that come out several years ago, I actually did sign petitions and did not want Amazon a part of it at all. And that is because Amazon is a big, giant, money-sucking, greedy company. And I don't have to go into the ethics. Do I use Amazon? Unfortunately, yes, I do, because it's very hard to find different things that I need out here in the middle of New Mexico. It's the last thing I go to though. I try to find it locally or in the state or through direct websites, but Amazon does work with small businesses and entrepreneurs and various people. So there's a portion of their business side, hello Clancy, that works well and that I don't mind. But I knew from the beginning that Amazon being involved in Lord of the Rings would be a problem. And you are covered in sap. And you smell good. That's nice. It's better than the manure you were rolling in earlier. I knew that it wasn't going to be a good deal. And so what I had set myself out to think was that this Rings of Power was going to be like fan fiction. And I was actually going to watch it. And I was like, it doesn't bother me. Whatever. Peter Jackson took some liberties. The Hobbit trilogy was not great. And people can't get it perfect. And we have the 3 original movies. So what's the problem, And as long as it's not done tastelessly and they don't change it too much, it's just kind of fan fiction with some of the same names and we'll roll through it. And I saw the first few trailers. I laughed. They just didn't look great. And then I started doing more research, seeing more information, but what truly tipped me over the edge was all of the content I was seeing around Galadriel. Galadriel is one of my favorite female characters, and Arwen and Éowyn. I love the way Tolkien handled female characters and how he wrote them with their gorgeous strength. I would call it beautiful strength. And they were prominent. They were obviously had a lot of grace and strength and power, but always seemed to manage it quite well, except when Galadriel was tempted, which is what I love about her story that we know, is that she wasn't perfect. She wasn't a badass right out the gate. And she was several hundred years old or thousands of years old. And so she had been through a lot in life, but even then she could still be tempted, going to prove that elves weren't infallible. They were, very human after all. And that's what I always liked about her. And the more I saw about the Galadriel from Rings of Power, the more I just yawned. I got bored. I was like, seriously? You think that to make a strong female character, you have to throw her in armor, kicking guys' butts and ice trolls and telling everybody no and marching around like she owns the place? You really think that a bossy woman is a strong, independent character? Like, why would you have to do that? Why would you have to take a character that doesn't have that in her background and manipulate it so? What does that mean? And then to show most of the men in the show being very, very weaselly, very, weak. And that is very far from what Tolkien set out to do. And so that's really seeing more of the trailers and the content around who and how they were writing Galadriel to be and her character turned me off. I don't have time for that kind of character in my life, unless it's somebody that's going to grow through a real significant change and we can see that, which it's possible that could happen. But I don't have time for that. That's not the woman I want to be. Yeah, I wield a sword. I ride horses. I chop wood. I haul water. I'll fight somebody if I need to. But, that doesn't define me as being a strong woman or a strong female character. Those are just some attributes and some talents and skills and survival skills I've learned along the way. But that's not who I am. And everybody wants to jump in and say that what your hobbies, your interests, what you're good at is who you are. And that's not always the case. Okay, so that's where I am in the fan spectrum, but I'm trying to have some grace, and I want to be welcoming because I think that the greatest thing about who Tolkien was and about his stories is that you can be a light fan, which means you're just in love with the aesthetic of Lord of the Rings and hobbit-y clothes and elven glamour and all this kind of stuff. You can be fans of that. And if you want more, you're going to watch the movies, you're going to watch the extended cut of the Peter Jacksons, you're going to watch the behind the scenes, and you're going to hear the intentions of Peter Jackson and the other writers and everyone involved, how much they wanted to be true to the books themselves, because they were huge fans of the books. They were massive fans of the books. And I think they did a terrific job and handled it very well. Now, you're going to go there, and if you want to go even further, you're going to want to dive into who Tolkien was. So let's start there, and let's welcome people to that part, because Tolkien and his relationship with God and who he was as a person speaks loud enough for itself. And really, we don't have to get in the way of it. But it is nice to know that, for me as an author, that if I were to die and if my stories were to impact people, they would fight for the intentions that I wrote in my books. That's very nice. Got a leak. Yeah. Okay. So who did write Tolkien for? Who did Tolkien write these stories for? Why did he write them? Well, we have to go back and look at the era, the time period. So gangster movies were a really big deal, gangster stories during that era, but we have World War I, we have World War II, we're, looking at, early 60s, late 50s, and, all through Tolkien's life, we're looking at a very different, very, very different time in England and in the world than we are today. Now, before Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and T.H. White and many more authors of that era were, really writing a lot of fantasy, there wasn't too much of it there. So we didn't have all this backlog and catalog of fantasy films and fantasy stories. There were fairy tales galore. And that's exactly why Tolkien wanted to write Lord of the Rings and the history of Middle-earth. Is, first of all, this is a man who loved people. He was a professor. He taught students. So he was an educator. He was somebody that, we should all be parading around in today's world as being one of the bravest persons. But he was also actually brave because he went and fought in the trenches in World War I, a very difficult time in our world's history. And so he was an educator. He was a purveyor of good smokes and fine ales and wonderful literature. And he was a linguistic. What is a linguistic? Well, a linguistic is somebody who studies language and words. And today, we're very apt to change how words mean, where they're from, and we look at them differently than somebody who loves them. And Tolkien loved words, and he wanted to create something that he loved, I think, and that he could share with others and stretch his mind and further his own personal education. That's my personal opinion. But here's the thing. Tolkien was looking around at the various folklore around him, and he actually found that there wasn't much true English folklore and fairy tales Now you say, wait a minute, you know, all the fairy tales that we know of, and all the British shows, and you know, what about King Arthur and this, that, and the other thing? No, wait a minute. Listen. So back then, you know, British weren't taking over the world of cinema or fantasy. Not everybody in the movies who was doing any kind of fantasy medieval movie was, you know, English. I mean, nowadays we have the BBC's long history of creating content. So pretend that none of that exists, because it really doesn't. There's very little of it. You know, Hollywood in America is doing a lot of cinema in medieval stories, obviously with Robin Hood and various others. But, you know, it just wasn't quite as, just the catalog, the backlog of all this content was not there like it is now, okay? So Tolkien was looking around and he realized that, you know, the King Arthur legend, much of what the English wrap their history around with King Arthur is actually French and or Welsh, which there is a difference. He also saw a lot of Irish folklore, Scottish folklore, Nordic folklore, German folklore, and honestly, all these other nations had lots more like fairy tales that originated within their culture's history. And he was not seeing something epic and broad like Beowulf or even Greek or Roman mythology that was a fantasy way of explaining how his nation and culture of people began. So really, Tolkien was writing for a misrepresented, underrepresented, and misunderstood and misappropriated culture. Now you're going to say like, whoa, those are some bold statements. I'll have some references below about how he said these different things. But yeah, so it wasn't English, white, British, everything in his day, all right? It really wasn't, okay? And so we're looking at it now from the lens of all this other material that we see coming out of Hollywood or out of England, or stories and books that we love and read. That wasn't there then. And so he wanted to set out and write the history of England like the history of Norway or Sweden or Finland, with the great epics of Odin and Thor and Freya and Beowulf. That's what he wanted to do. He loved those cultures, but he wanted to create something that was distinctly English and the history of England through fairy tale. That was one of his passions, from what I understand, from what he said and what others have said about him. And so it wasn't like he was trying to go out there and write a story with a message, which it does have a message, which is great, but he was actually trying to write something to help his peers be proud of who they were and what they had, in a story of hope and courage and bravery and faith and strong characters of all sizes and shapes. And so he was including the various little pockets of culture of English peoples within the Lord of the Rings, within the Fellowship, the Two Towers, the Unfinished Tales, the Silmarillion, the Children of Huron. And that is really what the whole story is. And so you're looking at somebody who was putting pen to paper on the history of England. So for the new actors of the Rings of Power to all be activists and to say, you know, they are so full of themselves, I have to say. I'm the first female dwarf to ever appear on screen. I'm, bringing my culture and my heritage. I'm this, I'm that, and I do this, and we do this. And they're just blowing their own horns like crazy. And they're not even really talking about any of the people who came before them to set them up to where they are, meaning Peter Jackson, the original films, nothing. So what I don't appreciate is that this actor here says, we've done something new and we're going to erase the old ones. Like, seriously, erase the old ones? That's the craziest thing. Like, what would be more respectful and honoring to it is to say, hey, I was a fan of those movies, and I'm so glad I got those and got into Tolkien, and I am so happy to be contributing as a new character and bringing parts of myself into this story. That's how you say that respectfully and humbly. And that's what I wish I would see out of this cast, and I just don't. Okay, take a sip. So Tolkien sets out to write the history of England in fairy tale form. He does so. And it is a huge hit. But it kind of, in certain circles in the 60s, a lot of hippies are getting into it, and sci-fi fantasy fans are really kind of coming into their own in this era. And there's a whole new generation of young people that are looking for a totally different kind of movie and book compared to their parents and what their parents grew up reading. Mark Twain and Robert E. Johnson and Robert E. Howard and many others, So they wanted something new and different. Here comes these great books, and The Hobbit. It actually does quite well. Many people back in the 70s wanted to make it a movie. They wanted to cast the Beatles as Frodo, Sam, Pippin, and Merry. And as, funny and fun as that would have been, Tolkien said no. And he was doing it not because he didn't want people to he didn't mind people making fun of his work, I'm sure, but that wasn't the intention of his, was to make it something pop culture. And that would have taken it directly into pop culture of the day. Not pop music, but what is popular within a culture. Really get it out there. Well, the fandom continued to grow. There was the cartoon made in the 70s, which is actually fantastic. It's super trippy and kind of creepy, but it's great. And then along comes Peter Jackson, who's a huge fan, who grew up in New Zealand. And as he was picturing the book, he saw his homeland. He's not seeing England, which is what, Tolkien was possibly writing about, was England itself, Scotland, Ireland, Wales. We don't exactly know the landscape he was picturing. But Peter Jackson, being of British descent, being a white New Zealander or whatever, this is what he identifies with in his culture, is this book and these stories. And so he and Fran Walsh and Philippia Boyens decide to begin writing, and their intention, Peter Jackson has said over and over again, is they didn't want to put their messages into Tolkien. They wanted to let Tolkien's work stand on its own, because that's truly what makes a classic. And though that book and these movies that have been out already for all these years are classics, they've stood the test of time. They're not full of agendas of the modern era or different things like that. They are just basic human truths. We all have a war and a struggle and a fight, and we have to have courage. We have to have hope. We got to fight for what's good. That is something that lasts through all ages. Okay. Now, what is Rings of Power really promoting? Is it really promoting something that's timeless and can be considered a classic? Or is it trying to promote what we're all just really dealing with right now, and the various short-term, short-sighted, not short-term, but short-sighted visions we all have for our communities and our society, So what is it that they're really trying to promote? And that's what we got to ask for. But the intention behind Peter Jackson was to honor the works of Tolkien. Now, Christopher Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien's son, thought that, Peter Jackson actually changed Tolkien forever by making it quite the action adventure film. And it was actually, a bit slower, more like an epic, like The Green Knight that Tolkien wrote, the poem, But, so what happened with what Peter Jackson did, even though I love it so much, is it took Tolkien's world and made it popular. Because back then, dear children, we didn't have the crazy amount of connectivity through the internet as we do now. We weren't all able to go and tweet about how we felt about The Lord of the Rings. We were just gobbling up every kind of magazine we could that had some kind of article, shared some new costume, and people were giving it plenty of crap back then, and even Tolkien fans. And then they went to go see it, and we all just loved it and fell in love with it. And some people still don't like it, but, Christopher Tolkien didn't appreciate that it made it like a modern action film. And it was important to do that to keep people hooked, because Peter Jackson was working for a company as an indie filmmaker, working for a company that wanted to make sales. And they were spending a lot of money, and they had to make that money back. And so it turned The Lord of the Rings into a pop culture icon. And guess what? It introduced it to other cultures and ethnicities and colors of people that had never really seen anything like that before, had maybe never read anything that Tolkien had written, introduced them to his world, and now they are fans of his work and fans of Lord of the Rings. They weren't excluded. They weren't looked over. They weren't pushed aside because they didn't fit the story. They weren't anything like that. Tolkien wrote a book for the English people, which at that time were predominantly white. They were, Anglo-Saxon. They were British. They were English. They had English ways. And so he wrote a book specifically for them. He wasn't trying to exclude other cultures and peoples. There are plenty of wonderful and fantastic South American and Mexican and African folklore and stories that we don't get to see. Now, that is something I would like to see. Instead of trying to fit everything into a small amount of stories, why don't we broaden the scope and bring in more Mexican folklore? Let's make some more movies about that. Let's make some more African folklore stories around their legends, like Shaka Zulu and various, so many more. There's so many, I can't even begin to be familiar with them at this point. But La Llorona, or come on, there's so much history and culture that other ethnicities grew up with. That's the stories that they knew. And then all of a sudden, here comes Lord of the Rings, that's broadcast around the world, wins a ton of awards, and becomes the #1 thing on every magazine in every country just about. And everyone is able to enjoy Tolkien and read his works, go back and watch the movies, read the books, whatever. And it becomes a pop culture item. And so from that point, we now have people who want to be included into the Lord of the Rings if they're a different ethnicity. And I don't think that there were not black elves or, elves of color or dwarves of color or different. There wasn't not that represented in plenty of fantasy. And it's been in most of all of their culture and ethnic stories. So now it's being introduced to a broader audience and including them. That's why, if you're fans of the movie, and you're wondering why you're a fan of the movies, and you're wondering why people are getting upset about the changes made to Tolkien, is because it's a classic. It is good because of how it was written. And to see it changed, to see it manipulated, to see it trashed, to see actors and writers and directors who are not fans of the work, of the movies because they want to erase them, or of the books because they think they're written by some old white dude, when, like I said before, he's somebody everyone should be calling the bravest of them all. He was a teacher. They're disrespecting all of that. And so for us deep fans of the work, we're like, why would we accept you into the fold? If you're going to be respectful of the author, the people who came before and created great content for us that helped dive us into the story more, great, fine. You are going to be standing on their shoulders, period, the end. You can't erase them. You can't down talk them. You can't just say, oh, those weren't inclusive and they were just this, that, and the other thing. You can't do that because you wouldn't even know anything about Lord of the Rings if it weren't for Peter Jackson and his work. If it weren't for them bringing it to pop culture so you would know what it was and dress up on TikTok like you want as an elf or a hobbit, or you wouldn't know about it. Okay? And if it weren't for Tolkien writing something that became the foundation stone of thousands, millions of fantasy authors after him, if he didn't exist and write his work, none of them would exist, or at least not much later. So don't you understand? The things that are in our past help shape our future. They're not things that we need to tear down and get rid of and call old-fashioned and all kinds of mean and nasty words that people have today. It is stuff that we get to stand on the shoulders of. Sure, some of it we improve on. Some of it we say, you know what, that was wrong. Talking about history and different things, we say that was a wrong point in history. That was not a good person. We're not going to continue to build what they were trying to build. We're going to build something else. Now, that is a totally different topic. Whereas what I'm talking about with Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings and the Rings of Power is that the Rings of Power is only able to sell, only able to get to you because of the Lord of the Rings, because of what Peter Jackson did and then what Tolkien wrote. So while you're out there looking at toxic fandom, this, that, and that, don't believe those words, okay? We're not toxic fans. There might be people that are rude and unkind, and that's just being rude and unkind. That's not the fact that Tolkien fans are upset that the work is being changed, because it doesn't need to be changed. It didn't need to be changed to be the movies, and it doesn't need to be changed to be the show. And for them to dishonor it and to not respect who it was written for, why it was written, and who wrote it, I'm sorry, that's not worth supporting. And we support by our wallet and by our watch time and what we give our time to on all these devices. And for those of us who refuse to watch The Rings of Power because we don't want to support a project or a business that does not honor and respect what we love, that's our prerogative, and absolutely we can do it, and it is absolutely not toxic. Now, if you're a light Tolkien fan, you don't care about anything I just said, you just love medieval fantasy, elf aesthetic, and you're going to watch Rings of Power, go for it. Nobody's stopping you. And if you have friends that make fun of you for watching it, just tell them, you know what, I like it. This is for me, you know. I am going to say that you need to check the intentions of the show, check the messages. Are the characters real? Are they relatable? Are they identifiable? Are they somebody that leaves you feeling really good about yourself? And does each episode make you feel like you're ready to go out and conquer the world and be a part of the world and live life as a better person? If this show does all that for you, all right. Fair enough. If you find it lacking, characters are unbelievable, and females aren't just like crazy, wicked, badass, cool, beat everybody type shit, and you're finding that at the end of each episode you're like, why did that even need to happen? What is even happening? This show does not make me feel good. Well, maybe you should stop watching it. So that's my 2 cents or 20 minutes worth of opinion when it comes to Tolkien, who he was writing his work for, and the shoulders that we're all standing on as fantasy authors and as fantasy lovers. And honestly, one day somebody is going to attack something that you love, and you will be passionate about defending it. And that is what we all are. We're passionate. We love the story. It changed our lives. The movies, Peter Jackson's story and how he as an indie filmmaker got to do Lord of the Rings, that has inspired me so greatly. And of course, I haven't wanted to write a world as in, create a world and be as in depth with the language and different things like that in my writing as Tolkien. But I love what he's done with characters and their whole arcs, and Aragorn and Legolas and Gimli and Arwen and Eowyn and Elrond and all of these different things, all of these different characters have inspired me. And the wonderful dialogue that he wrote and that Fran Walsh and Philippia Boyens wrote inspires me still. And Samwise Gamgee says while he's carrying Frodo to the top of Mordor, I can't carry it for you, but I can carry you. That is exactly why I have this channel, the Never Drop Your Sword. Because the sword is not only representative of the sword of the Spirit, which is the gospel of truth that I believe I need to carry with me as a Christian, that helps me defeat lies and become a better person. But it's also a symbol of hope and of justice, and the one thing that keeps you going, because it is a battle out there, folks, not just politically, not just ideology, it's just living and surviving is a battle. Now, we all have the freedom and the opportunity and the luxury of fighting over what we want to wear and dress and identify as. In other countries, people don't have that freedom. They're still surviving. And that is something we need to put into perspective more. And that's why these issues of, should Amazon be making Lord of the Rings, why that matters to us is because, is it true? Is it something we can take into battle to be a better person? Is it something that's going to hold us strong and faithful to who we are? Or is it just more garbage that encourages some real lacking individuals in this life? There's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. So let me know what you think in the comments. And friends, stay courageous.